So I'm delighted to welcome you to Mind's second annual lecture. My name is Ajay Khandelwal. I'm the director of Mind, and I'm extremely excited that we have such a brilliant panel of speakers. I first met Dorothée in 2014 as part of the Mind Psychosis Project in Islington, and Dorothée is a writer, a psychoanalyst, and the founding member of the Psychosis Therapy Project, which she has painstakingly built up from scratch through her labours, and it's flourishing in North London, and our plan is to bring it to South London and of course make it much better because it's going to be in South London. And she is joined today by Barry Watts, who is a senior therapist, psychoanalyst, and academic and a housing activist, also connected to the project from its early days, and also Paul Michan, who is a therapist and member of the project. Additionally, he's a commissioner and involved in public services for many, many years. So without anything further to say, I'm going to pass over to Dorothée.
Right, so I will start, of course, by thanking Lambeth Mind and Ajay for the opportunity to speak to everyone today and to develop the Psychosis Therapy Project in South London. We're getting a bit ambitious. We sort of are becoming a London-wide service, hopefully, and then next we'll maybe go global, perhaps. In fact, there are other centers in other countries that do this kind of work. I'm in touch with a place in Paris that's called the Questenberg Center in the 13th arrondissement that's been doing this kind of work for many years. They started in the 70s, so I think it's time for us to catch up a little bit, and we are sort of weaving collaborative links with them. There are also organizations in Canada that do this kind of work. You might have heard of Daniel Bergeron, and they have a very interesting project with young people. So this is the kind of landscape that I wanted to outline, and to think of collaborating, you know, as much as we can with like-minded clinicians across the world, and try to help with the treatment of psychosis. I wanted to thank Block 336 for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be here, as always. And I wanted to thank all the therapists and volunteers for being so committed to this project. Without them, we just really couldn't be at all. And of course, I want to thank all of you for being here. It's great to see so many people mobilized in this way to discuss the issue of psychosis and its treatment in the community. I wanted to premise this discussion by pointing out the severity of the mental health crisis that we are facing at the moment, and not to be a pessimist, but I think things are likely to get much worse. So we have to be prepared for that. However, we are not prepared for that because we do not have the resources or the support that we need to meet the needs, the growing needs of many people. I mean, the mental health safety net is already sort of falling apart. I think we can say that. The small fish are going to already fall through the cracks. The big fish might remain there in a state of over-medicated sort of slumber, but the needs of people are not being cared for, and so we need to remain mobilized and do what we can to somehow maintain a mental health safety net at all costs. So this is one of the things that the Psychosis Therapy Project is very keen to pursue with your help. So thank you for that. I guess I wanted to maybe talk about the title of this talk a little bit, because when we sort of decided to entitle it, Can Psychoanalysis Treat Psychosis? Of course, it's not really a new question to raise. I think psychoanalysis has treated psychosis over time. If you think of people like Jung, Ferenczi, Lacan, Winnicott, Hannah Segal, Bion, you know, all these people as clinicians engage with psychosis extensively, and of course their contribution is an important thing to remember. It's not like we sort of started this tradition. And I was reminded recently of Murray Jackson here in this area, who at the Maudsley in the 70s had a 10-bed unit with psychoanalytic treatment for people with psychosis. I think it was called Ward 6. And so that's an important thing to remember, of course. Unfortunately, I don't think Ward 6 exists anymore, so it's time to reawaken all these traditions. There is a strong psychoanalytic tradition at the Maudsley, from what I heard, so we're hoping that we can collaborate with people in order to implement these approaches and strategies. So psychoanalysis continues to treat psychosis, that's the hope. Perhaps, and that's a little sort of thing I wanted to add here, provided psychosis is something that needs to be treated. I think the term treatment is always problematic. I think I do sort of endorse the idea of a psychoanalytic treatment, but by treatment I mean more of a kind of engagement, I guess, with psychosis. That would be a therapeutic, clinical one, but also a theoretical and ethical one. That's quite important. And one that definitely, suspends the medical model of cure. I think that's important to sort of like say that, and calls for a destigmatization of psychosis. Positing the validity of the psychotic experience is a very important thing to do. I think at the Psychosis Therapy Project, we're very much against the idea of a treatment that would be designed to reform, if you want, the experience, to somehow instate a normalizing reality that would stunt and censor the reality that psychotic subjects bring to us by sort of saying, well, it's not reality, so you don't want to engage with that, forget about it, and provide some kind of corrective that would in fact deprive individuals of their most precious safeguards. So I think therapeutically, when you start validating an experience that is brought to you, that's already something that is very beneficial. You can see that. And we don't pretend that we do it. We really do it. We really believe in the experience, and we work within the experience, which is very important, which means we let people guide us completely because, you know, they have their way of theorizing things, and that's what we work with. We don't work against that. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say from the outset. Now, what does it mean, psychoanalytic treatment of psychosis? Maybe we need to pause and wonder about the implications of that. Well, historically, it's kind of interesting because that can mean a variety of theoretical positions, because people in the psychoanalytic field have worked with psychosis from a Kleinian, Lacanian, Jungian, many different perspectives. But at the same time, there is a distinct experience, I think, that is recognizable as such across the various theorizations. And that's kind of striking with psychosis. If you have a bunch of clinicians in a room who all work with psychosis, regardless of their differences, there is a convergence, I think, that is possible, some kind of consensus on the basis of the phenomena that we encounter. And in a way, that's a rather hopeful thing, because this means that there's perhaps more room for dialogue and exchange when we talk about psychosis. I mean, of course, we have different theories, different ways of theorizing psychosis. We have different metapsychologies. But I think psychosis is perhaps a good place to have conversations. And when we had this big conference at the Freud Museum last year, some of you were there, that was a good example of that. There were people from all kinds of different perspectives, but there was a real conversation, I think, that took place, and we all agreed on, in a way, not what psychosis is, because that's a very complicated question, but there's something about the clinical experience that was sort of somehow something we could all agree on, which is kind of interesting in itself. So perhaps, and I might lapse a little bit into my own theorization there, so I apologize for that, but that's kind of inevitable. I think what makes psychosis distinct, or the psychotic experience distinct, is perhaps the breakdown of the mechanisms of repression. Now, I'm already kind of lapsing into psychoanalytic notions as well, but I think that's kind of an important thing to do. It's breakdown or malfunctioning, so there's a bit of a spectrum there. You can have mechanisms of repression that function intermittently in some individuals. There could be a temporary sort of breakdown of repression, and then at the end of the spectrum, you will have people who have a more sort of permanent loss of the sort of repression mechanisms. Now, everyone knows what repression implies, or do I have to sort of do a little crash course on repression briefly? Just 2 words. Repression is a mechanism that strives to keep drive-related demands away from consciousness. Demands that would somehow generate conflict, that would sort of break or threaten the equilibrium of the ego. There are things that sort of, the ego cannot quite accommodate these demands. So repression kicks in to sort of make sure that those things remain below the bar. But of course, and that's kind of interesting in itself, repression is faulty. So the repressed returns, and it returns in a distorted form, an unrecognizable form, which often the subject experiences as a symptom, right? So that's kind of, you know, sort of basic neurotic organization. And psychoanalysis traditionally is interested in lifting repression in order to integrate these drive-related demands, or at least sort of limit the return of the repressed in a symptomatic form. And, you know, phobia is a good example of that. You have people who, you know, for example, I don't know, can't get on a train or something like that. And then once you have identified the repressed conflict that leads them to not want to be on the train, then, you know, if all goes well, they'll be able to book their ticket and sort of go to Paris. So anyway, hopefully, if all goes well. And Freud says that repression is the cornerstone on which the whole structure of psychoanalysis rests. He writes that in 1914. And it's true that his writings on technique, and those of you who have read them, and I recommend you read them once a year, that's recommended for everyone, at least, will know that it's true he elaborates a technique that deals with those mechanisms, repression, return of the repressed. Now, of course, in psychosis, this cornerstone is not really there, or at least it's there in this faulty way, which makes things a bit more complicated. That doesn't mean, however, that psychoanalysis should be excluded from the field of psychoanalysis. It might be excluded from the technique elaborated by Freud on the basis of mechanisms of repression, but it also means that you have a chance to observe what happens when repression doesn't. So you kind of like are on the flip side of repression with psychosis, and of course, that's the advantage, the access to unconscious material will therefore be more direct, if you want. Since you don't have the bar of repression to kind of distort things, there's no distortion, really. So you actually are in a very privileged place as a clinician. And of course, because the unconscious is the object of study of psychoanalysis, something else that Freud states, you, in fact, are in a bit of a gold mine from a theoretical perspective, if you're interested in psychosis. So that's one quick sort of specificity of what I mean by psychoanalytic treatment of psychosis. It's one that, therefore, is of a special metapsychological importance. And that's something that's not for everybody, I realize. By metapsychology, people don't think it's, you know, people think it's a bit tedious and it's very difficult. But I personally feel that a very important part of this work is to theorize what we do and to somehow contribute to metapsychology. And working in psychosis is one area where you really can do that. And in fact, it's interesting because clinicians of psychosis talk about a duty to theorize when you work with psychosis. And I think there is, in fact, a kind of imperative to, you know, symbolize the kinds of encounter that we have when we work clinically with psychosis, just because there's an urgency to somehow perhaps put words on what we do and what we observe. And that is something that is quite specific to, I think, the psychoanalytic approach, that it's a psychoanalytic theorization of psychotic phenomena. So that's something that I just wanted to stress briefly. Now, a few sort of perhaps words on the clinical picture of psychosis, just kind of what are the implications of this breakdown or failure of repression. I'm not going to go into too many details because that would be a bit too technical. But the main thing to bear in mind is that it implies a breakdown of the metaphorical function, or symbol formation, if you want. That means that the psychotic perspective will be radically literal, okay? So if you can imagine the sort of as if that we constantly do on a daily basis, we constantly operate as if something was something else, or this word means this, for example. In psychosis, that is foreclosed. That means, you know, the word is the thing, what Freud says very eloquently. So that loss of the metaphorical function, which once again, there are degrees, you know, it's not always complete. Sometimes people are completely in this sort of literal sort of universe, so everything is sort of very direct in their experience of them. But some people it comes and goes, some people in some privileged areas where that will be the case. But the implications, if you think about the relation between subject and object, or object relations, is that therefore there is no permanence of the object, which is something that's quite distinct in psychosis as well. I mean, if you think about, you know, I don't know how much Freud you've read, but the kind of theorization of the fourth da, which is very famous, where the child can negotiate the absence of the mother by using play and developing a strategy to master the present, the alternation between presence and absence. Well, that's something that is just not available to the psychotic subject, this kind of negotiation, if you want, through metaphor, because that's kind of what the Forda somehow can be read as. What else can I tell you? The unconscious tends to flood the conscious, therefore. There's no real sort of partition between the two. And that also leads to a loss of the distinction between perception and memory, which is also quite distinct in psychosis. Memories, fantasies, facts, everything is a bit on the same level. There's no differentiation there. So you work in this kind of very confusing sort of landscape, which is another specificity. And a last one that I wanted to foreground is the absence of triangulation. If you think about the second topography, where you would have a sort of, you know, super-ego, ego-id kind of structure, in this case, the third term doesn't quite manage to sort of break the dyadic sort of model that would be more typical of primary mechanisms, and so you're left with something that bars the access to secondary process. So, you know, what all this psychoanalytic shorthand refers to, I will now translate into maybe something a bit more accessible, is the persistent collapse of subjectivity in psychosis and the fundamental precariousness of existence. Now, these are the kinds of things that we deal with. In the psychotic experience, the link between thinking and being is somewhat broken. The word is no longer stitched to the flesh. And when psychotic subjects come to therapy, basically that's what they want to address. They want to address the loss of their subjectivity and claim their right to be a subject. Their demand, which is a rightful one, is for subjective delineation and substantiality. So, you know, basically the questions raised are questions of existence and identity. Do I exist or not? Am I or am I not? You're really in the sort of ontological sort of area. So how does psychoanalysis respond to such fragility of being? Well, I will quote Freud once again, who in 1915 says, psychoanalytic treatment is founded on truthfulness. Now, I don't mean truthfulness in a kind of romantic way, like let's be spontaneous and truthful. I mean truthfulness as a technical requirement and as something that is opposed to deception. Deception comes in many ways and many forms for the analyst and for all of us, and it's mainly nested in his or her therapeutic ambitions. That's in fact the big enemy in this kind of work. It's tied to the ego-synthetic function, whether we're talking about purposive representations, hermeneutical activity, trying to make sense of things, you know, all that is actually really getting in the way of your ability to be completely available to the other person. I will quote Freud once again. It's one of my favorite quotes. "The feeling that is most dangerous to a psychoanalyst is the therapeutic ambition to achieve by this novel and much disputed method something that will produce a convincing effect upon other people." Do I need to repeat that, or yeah? So the feeling that is most dangerous to a psychoanalyst is the therapeutic ambition to achieve by this novel and much disputed method something that will produce a convincing effect upon other people. So in fact, the good intentions of the analyst are your worst enemy. And it's something that in psychosis is absolutely vital. And the reason why it's especially vital is because if you have a kind of purpose or intention or ambition, that comes from you, right? And you are dealing with someone for whom, in a way, there is no real room for two. So if you're the one saying, well, I know what's best for you, that leaves the person with nothing to sort of work with, because you're basically taking away their chance to tell you what it might be that is best for them, right? So if you do not sort of decide to sort of systematically frustrate all forms of ego gratification as an analyst, and if you do not sort of opt for the rule of abstinence at its utmost, the danger is that you might align yourself with the omnipotent expropriating violence that presides over your patient's life. I don't know how clear that is. We can talk about it some more with questions. But it's this kind of almost asceticism, maybe? Would that be a good term to describe? You really have to strip yourself of everything as much as possible. And of course, that's impossible, but you have to try to do it. You have to be, what I always say, is sort of adopt the subjectivity degree zero position, where you are this kind of, and you, of course, then you are an object for them, because then they can model you, they can sort of make you be what they need you to be in order to somehow capture their own subjectivity. I guess that could be a good way to put it. And it's very difficult to do, obviously. And otherwise, well, then you're in very dangerous territory. And the consequences of not suspending all this can sometimes be quite lethal. You will lose your patient because you know, they sort of decide that you have become one of the persecutory people in the system. And that's because you have imposed, if you want, your own view of what's best for them. Now, of course, as I'm saying this, this will be interesting to confront with the model of recovery and rehabilitation that is the dominant one in the sort of system we work in. And you can see the potential there for an idea of recovery, for example, that would become very persecutory because it's a kind of ready-made solution which is imposed on individuals, implemented with the best of intentions by social workers or mental health staff, you know, across all the services we work with. But the problem with that is that there is this idea that they know what's best for the patient, right? And that often leads people to not listen to the patient at all. So of course, in my position, I'm dealing with patients who are complaining, you know, to me by sort of, you know, and they get really sometimes very persecuted, and the collaboration becomes impossible because they are not listened to, and there's an insistence to kind of shove solution down their throat, when in fact it would be much more effective to let them articulate the kind of support that would be useful to them. Now, of course, no one has the time or the resources or the staff to sort of implement these approaches. And so the problem also that I've encountered is that I think there's not enough support, perhaps, for social workers or, you know, people in mental health services. They are not really trained to not take things very personally. And I've witnessed on so many occasions, you know, people who feel that they are failing to help someone, right? And then that's kind of like becoming, you know, well, you know, you really should be getting better. How dare you not get better, you know, very quickly. And there's a bit of an escalation then that happens where the failure of the intervention is taken very personally by the sort of social worker or mental health sort of worker, and then they kind of become hateful towards the patient. And there's a bit of a cycle that I've seen so many times that then is a very hard one to break. And basically, it's bad for everybody, frankly, because I'm sure it's very hard for, you know, these workers. They feel very helpless. They have too much work. They're overworked, understaffed. And at the same time, they feel like they have failed their patients. And that becomes a bit of a sort of difficult situation. So we try to work against that at the Psychosis Therapy Project. And before I sort of stop talking, there are two preconceptions that I've encountered, in the system working in the community. And I want to put that on the table because I think these are very crippling preconceptions. And the first one is the idea of dependency, that there is this great fear that we are creating dependency. That's a big word. I was reading about the economic dependency of spouses, right, who don't make enough money to remain with their husband in this country. They come from another. They use that same term, economic dependency. That's just this terrible disease. And I'm very troubled by that because I find that dependency, if you analyze, you know, the sort of what is implied here, it means a view of the patient or the, you know, the person you're working with that is very manipulative, very helpless, that will sort of like be very needy, and if you give them too much, they're not going to want to let go of you. And it's just like, well, you know, my experience is that when people get better, I'm the last person they want to see, you know. They are running fast, and they just don't want to have anything to do with me. And yeah, they will come back if things get tough again, but I don't feel that, you know, I've created dependency by just saying, sure, you can come as long as you want, you know, as long as you think is right for you. And that's something that I think the idea of dependability perhaps is a much better idea. And the other thing is that people have no qualms about chemical dependency. We put people on drugs for life, and these are very toxic for them, they're very harmful for them, and they don't really help them very much. And no one says anything about that, whereas the idea that they might be in therapy for life is just absolutely outrageous, when in fact it would be a lot cheaper, and a lot more effective, and a lot more humane. So these are some of the things that I think are important to say. And I have been in contact with psychiatrists who are very open to a dialogue and to sort of, you know, I say, well, maybe you should, like, you know, reduce the meds here a bit because this patient, like, can't stay awake, you know? It's like, whoa. And the patient has tried to say that, but of course, because it comes from a perspective that is not really listened to, it took a letter from the therapist with the big stamp and everything to sort of alert the psychiatrist that maybe they could change things a bit. And of course, we never have the same psychiatrist twice, so that's another problem. It's very hard to have a kind of continuity of, you know, the people we work with. But there is hope. I think psychiatrists, sorry, I keep doing that. Psychiatrists are feeling very helpless. They're very anxious, the ones that I've met. They have to sort of keep people alive. You know, that's the sort of main thing that they think about. But I think if we collaborate more with them, perhaps these kinds of fears of reducing medication, for example, would not be the worst idea in the world. And the other sort of preconception that I've encountered is the one that accuses us of colluding with the symptoms. So we're really evil because we engage with the delusions of our service users and we work within their experience. And I will let my colleague Barry talk a little more about that because I think he wanted to speak a bit about this sort of idea of working with the experience. But I think that's another thing that's not helpful, I think, to people, to not be allowed to engage with the experience. And there is a tendency, perhaps in the system, and maybe I'm sort of wrong about that, I hope I am actually, but people are discouraged from engaging with their experience, from making sense of it. It's like, oh well, you know, for example, people who might have a psychotic episode and then they're better, sometimes they come to us saying, well, you know, I'd really like to work now that I'm better so that I can make sense of what happened to me. And I always say, well, that's a great idea, But I know that they've been discouraged from doing that. It's like, oh, you don't want to go back there, that might trigger something, you know. And it's just like, well, we have to stop being afraid, you know. We have to start looking at the reality of these experiences. They're very valuable ones. They're full of creativity. They can be devastating. They can destroy people's lives, but I think engaging with them and working within them is by far our best bet. So I think I will conclude now to let other people talk by sort of, you know, perhaps be a bit more, you know, pessimistic, or at least telling you a bit about how demanding this kind of work is. However, it's very difficult. The weight of our patients' ontological insecurity or precariousness is huge, okay? And the kind of work that we have to do is extremely subtle, so it requires a lot of subtlety to, you know, accompany someone in their search for subjectivity. It's very, very difficult work. And sometimes, and often even, it's a matter of life and death. And we sometimes lose out to the powers of destruction at work. We can't help everybody. And we learn from our mistake, sometimes the hard way. So that can be very difficult. But for all it's worth, I think we persevere. And we try to maintain that mental health safety net that I talked about at the beginning. And I think this is what the Psychosis Therapy Project is about. And I take this opportunity to thank all my service users or patients, I don't know how to call them, but you know, they've been part of my life for quite a long time now. I want to thank them for their trust and for all the invaluable things that they have taught me over the years. And I feel a lot wiser for spending so many hours in their company. So I thank them deeply. And of course, I thank you all for your support.
Thank you very much for that very rich presentation, and there will be an opportunity at the end for your questions. So next we have Barry Watt, who's a senior analyst. Yes, a senior analyst at the Psychosis Therapy Project.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? The microphone's working? Good, okay. I'm really going to be picking up on quite a few of the themes that Dorothée has already mentioned, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time discussing the question of reality in psychosis, or what it is that we understand when we invoke notions of reality in psychosis. And I'm going to start this morning with, I won't exactly call it a clinical vignette, more of a sort of a clinical anecdote. And this was from about 6 or 7 years ago, when I was a caseworker in a charity in the criminal justice system, just down the road from where we are at the moment in the Elephant and Castle. And our service had contact with a Colombian man in his mid-20s who had been attacked in the supermarket, and he got in touch and wanted to come in for a chat with us. I thought this would be an ideal case for a new colleague to pick up, because I'd read the police report. It seemed pretty straightforward. There didn't seem much to it, but she asked if I would come along to the interview anyways, because she was still sort of getting used to some of the basic counselling and listening skills that she'd had on joining. Now, when this gentleman actually turned up to the service and we met with him, it became very clear almost straight away that what the police report had led us to believe wasn't in fact the case at all. So when we asked him to tell us what had happened to him, rather than sort of describing that he'd been thumped on the head in the Morrisons on the Walworth Road, he related it as a very predictable instance of a campaign that was being prosecuted against him by this shadowy organisation that had set itself the task of controlling his erections. Now, the organisation had already installed this state-of-art device in the vacant flat above where he lived, and when he was at home, the device was connected to his penis by millions of tiny fibre optic cables, and in this way it sort of regulated his erections when he was at home, but it hadn't yet been able to be developed to have remote operation. So when he was out and about, they had to the organisation had to send people to trail him to make sure that everything was okay. Now, you can imagine the surprise of my colleague, who had only been in the job for about a week, expected that she was going to be meeting with a man talking about, well, somebody beat me up in the supermarket, and was very shocked, and she began to blush and sort of began to chuckle a little bit. And this gentleman, took this not as her being rude or disrespectful to his experience, but as proof of the powers that were operating through him, that he was a temporary vessel for. So I asked him what it was that he wanted from our service. Why had he gotten in touch? How was it that he thought that we might be able to help him? Did he want us to help him to sort of push charges against the bloke that had attacked him in the supermarket? And he said, no, absolutely not, because the organisation, it was in cahoots with the police and with the judiciary, and they would ensure that it would all be thrown out of court anyways. But he was also concerned that the organisation would then start taking more stringent measures against him. And for him, you see, this has actually been quite useful, the organisation. It had helped him to get on with his life, but it had begun to interfere within his sex life in ways that he didn't want to. So sort of a few weeks, or in the weeks leading up to the attack, he'd met 2 women that he'd been attracted to, but he'd lost his potency with them, and that left him feeling very ashamed and very embarrassed in front of them. And he thought that was evidence that the organisation was going too far, that they were meddling where they shouldn't be. So what he wanted us to do, as part of the general authorities, was to contact the organisation on his behalf, a couple of phone calls, put in a few words, and sort of advocate them to change the way they were handling his case. Now, at this point, my colleague, who'd sort of recomposed herself and sort of recovered from the initial shock of what she was hearing, sort of piped up, and she said to the man, well, you've got to understand, she said this very sympathetically, very tactfully, that we can't possibly contact this organisation because they don't exist. This is just in your imagination. And if we were to sit here with you, we would be colluding with you if we were to pretend otherwise. And he'd heard all of this before, so he sort of sighed a long sigh and said, yes, of course, this is what everybody says. It's just in my head. And but I know that it's real because I can feel this power flowing through me, and that doesn't explain, if I'm so powerful, why it is that I'm having these performance problems with these women. It must be down to the organisation. So I sort of wanted to preface what I have to say today by introducing this sort of clinical anecdote, because I think for anybody that's spent time listening to the experiences of those who've been labelled psychotic, this will be an extremely familiar story. In fact, it's almost something of a genre piece. Okay? So there's this disturbed relationship with the body that's sort of invested with these forces which are imposed from without and controlled and manipulated from without. There's also the paranoid trope of the shadowy, mysterious organisation sort of pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And then finally, of course, there is the influencing machine, which could have almost been lifted verbatim from Victor Tausk's famous essay of the same name. And although you can see from this sort of story that some of his psychical scaffolding was beginning to wobble a little bit, it had actually, up to that point, worked remarkably well for him. He was otherwise leading a pretty ordinary life. Day to day, he had a job, he was working, he was studying, and didn't encounter any other difficulties. So what I want to use this as the opportunity to sort of explore with you or talk with you today is what do we do when we're confronted with people who present with accounts or experiences of reality which seem to be so divergent from what we can take to be our everyday experience, what we might call consensual reality. I think intuitively we want to respond as my colleague responded. We want to say that there's been some sort of break with reality. Common sense almost sort of leads us to wanting to think that if we can just find a convincing enough way to impart the correct way of understanding the world, the correct way of seeing the world, eventually people who are labelled psychotic will perceive the world accurately. They will come to a truer perception of reality. Now, I think that this is very widespread. It's a little bit of a straw man. I think most of us have quite a flexible understanding, and what might be real for me is not necessarily real for you. Nevertheless, I think it can sometimes hang about as an unspoken assumption in sort of social care and psychiatric psychological work. And I'm going to call this fallacy, and I'm going to pronounce the name wrong, so if there's any Polish speakers here, please correct me. I'm going to call it the Rokic fallacy, after the social psychologist Milton Rokic. Now, Rokic was working at Ypsilanti State Hospital in Michigan in the late 1950s and 1960s, and he hatched this idea while he was working there, that he would bring together 3 men he had on the ward who each had the delusion that they were Jesus Christ. He would bring them together and confront them with each other. And so his idea is really incredibly simple. He thought that since there were 3 of them, but there could only be one Christ, if they were to meet daily for an extended period, they would be forced to have to conclude, well, I can't really be Christ in that sense. So this didn't happen. Straight away, they found ways in which to maintain their belief. So Rokic began to start manipulating the situation. He began to devise scenarios on the ward, putting them into that would challenge their convictions. He even sort of introduced messages to them from characters that were drawn from their system of belief about the world. And in the case of one of the Christs, he went so far as to invent a fictional wife for this man and actually wrote him letters purporting to be from her. Still, no change. They hung on to their conviction, so that I suppose nowadays we might remember this experiment as being more of a cautionary tale of medical ethics than a helpful way in which to work with people who've been diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenics. But we might want to wonder then, well, why did this experiment fail? What went wrong with it? And I think it's really, really helpful here, and Dorothée's already beautifully brought in some theorizing of Freud's, and I think it is really, really helpful if we go back to some of Freud's most well-known and sort of famous ideas about psychosis. So I'm just going to offer a quote from Freud. One of his formulations is that he suggests that in psychosis, the ego, in the service of its id, withdraws from a piece of reality. Or in a different formulation, but making the same point, he says that whereas neurosis is the result of the conflict between the ego and the id, psychosis is the analogous outcome of a similar disturbance between the ego and the external world. Now, what this means is that, as Dorothée has sort of already explained, is that where Freud is placing the emphasis is on the initial moment of psychological decomposition, the initial turning away from an unbearable fragment of reality. And it's not the secondary phenomena that is important in working with psychosis. Okay, what's important isn't the symptoms, it's the place that the symptoms have in somebody's life, the role, the work that they do for that individual. Just to offer another famous quote of Freud's on this, he proposed that symptoms, especially delusions, delusional belief, are applied like a patch over the place where originally a rent had appeared in the ego's relation to the external world. So that in psychosis, quote, the delusional formation which we take to be a pathological product is in reality an attempt at recovery, a process of destruction. So,
I want to say that again.
Okay, is it worthwhile me repeating that? So, in psychosis, the delusional formation, so in the case of the 3 Christs, for example, or the gentleman at the beginning of the talk, they are an attempt at recovery. They're an attempt to self-heal, to auto-mend, I suppose we could say. Now, I'm mentioning these ideas of Freud's because I think they take us right to the heart of a lot of what's at stake in working with psychosis. So, like Rokic, Freud understands psychosis by appealing to an external world or a reality that is shunned by the ego, although unlike Rokic, he has a problematized or he's got a question mark over what reality means. So Freud suggests that where we apprehend our experiences of the world neurotically or psychotically, then that reality, the apprehension that reality amounts to is always partially constructed by us. In the case of the neurotic, Freud argued that the disagreeable element of reality is simply ignored. It's replaced with a flight into a world suffused with fantasy. Whereas for the psychotic, on the other hand, there's an attempt to remodel reality itself. And this has important bearings on what Freud understands by psychical health. So I'm going to quote another bit of Freud here. He says, "We call behavior normal or healthy if it combines certain features of both reactions to reality, both reactions associated with psychosis and neurosis." That is to say, psychical life is characterized by health if it, quote, disavows reality as little does a neurosis, but it exerts itself, as does a psychosis, in an attempt to try and alter reality. Now, I wanted to talk about this because it strikes me, and I think Dorothée has already sort of mentioned some of the different experiences that we have working in different ways with psychosis, that psychosis in sort of the health service, social workers, lots of different people who sort of engage with it, still approach psychosis as a problem of erroneous mental content, this estrangement from reality, the deviation from a biological norm. And the unspoken assumption is that there would be some unproblematic standpoint from which clinicians can assess reality, as if their egos aren't also in their own way distorting reality. So that in this way, sort of experiences such as voice hearing or visual hallucinations are regarded objectively and scientifically, with the assumption that science and objectivity aren't also modes of ego distortion, aren't also themselves a flight from reality. Of course, I'm not arguing against scientific method or objectivity. That would be absurd. All I'm saying is that those are different ways of modeling reality, and perhaps we can forget this. To give you an example, I share a patient with an NHS psychologist, and he's got very relentless symptoms that are very, very frustrating to work with. When he meets with his psychologist in the NHS, she will produce diagrams of the brain for him and will point on these diagrams to the bits of the brain that she thinks aren't working properly for him. She argues with him that he needs to begin to treat his voices as if they aren't real. She said, they're just in your imagination. What you need to do is react to them as if you would do to a baby crying. You leave the baby to cry, and eventually it would exhaust itself. Now, he objects to this, and he storms out and tells her that she's talking a load of rubbish, and her response is, well, we need to look at your medication then. We need to think about putting you onto a new drug or changing the dose. Meanwhile, the key workers that he's engaged with, in needing to seek supported housing. He has very stormy relationships with many of the people that he engages with. They try and disabuse him of what they take to be his erroneous explanation as to why these relationships are so conflictual for him. So what they do is they take up this sort of function as auxiliary reality testers, that they test reality for him and tell him this is actually really the way that things are. We know best about this. That is, they try and force real reality onto him. But this, of course, just stokes his paranoia and leaves him feeling persecuted. And he ends up in a very, very vulnerable position because he is sort of bound to continue to engage with the NHS, bound to engage with his key workers for access to social security, for access to housing benefit. And he feels disinclined to do so, therefore putting the very stability of his life and his well-being at risk. So we can see there's some sort of profound practical problem working with psychosis if we follow this route. Now, I think sort of not engaging with these deeper questions of reality can lead us into quite a hubristic position, this sort of position of mastery, into us mistaking ourselves as to be the ones that really do know about what's going on. And Freud himself grappled with this question. At the end of his study of Daniel Schreiber, he wrote, and I'll quote some more Freud here. He says, "It remains for the future to decide whether there is more delusion in my theory than I should like to admit, or whether there is more truth in Schreber's delusion than other people are as yet prepared to believe." Now, Freud's only recourse in this situation as to whether psychoanalysis is possibly just one delusional system amongst other delusional systems is to fall back on this notion of consensual reality. He says, but I can nevertheless call a friend and fellow specialist to bear witness to my theory of paranoia, while Schreber himself alone had himself only to offer testimony to his ideas. So we can see that this sort of notion of appeals to shared reality are really, really philosophically problematic. And if we approach psychosis as an attempt to sort of correct faulty beliefs or promote correct mental functioning, then this is only ever going to be done from the standpoint of an individual clinician or even community of clinicians and their perspective on what counts as real, passes as normal, or is best judged as being true. And of course, this really is a form of clinical violence, I think, that ends up treating the patient as your personal property. This is what Freud says in his 1918 Budapest address, is that, the patient is not ours to own. We have absolutely no right to force onto them our way of seeing in the world as if it was better, more worthwhile, or whatever the case might be. So, just to round up, I want to sort of say a few words about what might look like a better or more appropriate model for working with psychosis. Dorothée has already sort of said a few words on that, and I would like to link psychosis with the rather popular and well-known connection that's often drawn between the figure of the psychotic and the figure of the artist, because Freud's theorization of who the artist is and who the psychotic is, they actually come quite close. So I'm going to quote Freud here again. He characterizes the artist as the one who turns away from reality because he cannot come to terms with the renunciation of drive satisfaction, one who allows his erotic and ambitious wishes full life of fantasy. But of course, what we don't do with the artist is say they're just wallowing in falsehood. In fact, what we do is we treat what the artist does as incredibly valuable. Freud says, quote, "The artist molds their fantasies into truths of new kinds which are valued by men as precious reflections of reality." And I think it's important that we approach psychosis in the same sort of spirit. And this is going to bring me back to Rokic's experiment that I mentioned earlier. So, although none of the men renounced their conviction to being the true Christ, after some initial bad blood between them, they did modify their systems of comprehension of the world, which allowed them to sort of live quite peaceably and to get along together quite peaceably. Rokic, on the other hand, clung tenaciously to his method and his conviction of persuading them of what he took to be their spurious identities. Experiment written 20 years later, Rokic said, quote, "In my eagerness to be objective and scientific and to focus on the effects of my experimentally arranged confrontation on the three Christ's beliefs and behavior, I had overlooked the effect of the confrontation on my as well as their delusional beliefs and behaviors," end quote. Part of this delusion, I would suggest, resided in Rokic's mistaking the scientific method he adopted as indubitable, the staunch to objectively conclude conducting his investigation into the three Christ stories as being uncontaminated by his own fantasy life, so that the truth that they had to tell him in their stories was missed. Now, in later years, Rokic came to view the experiment not so much as his attempt to cure the three Christs, but of how the three Christs had, in fact, cured him of his own fantasies of omnipotence. In fact, he even belatedly realized he'd miscalculated the number of Christs involved in the experiment because he himself surely counted as the fourth. So, this is what he said. Three Christs of their delusions, they had succeeded in curing me of mine. my godlike delusion that I could change them omnipotently and omnisciently, arranging and rearranging their daily lives within the framework of a total. So in other words, something of the narcissism of minor differences was provoked in Bracich. The more intensively free Christ shrugged off his sense of deity, his institutional scheming and scabbing, his proselytization of systems of truth and mission as saviour of souls, the more the three Christs became his rivals instead of his patients. So, despite initially seeming to Bracich that a definitively objective and scientific story could be told about the three Christs, one that did not include himself as a sort of omniscient observer above the fray, in the decades after the experiment, he appreciated how exactly such a stance was what implicated him the most. In the end, he had to concede he was inseparable from the experiment he'd been trying to conduct. And in this way, rather ironically, by sacrificing the three Christs for his own clinical ambitions, they ended up saving something of his soul, and he ended up confirming them in their identity.
And the final of the three analysts here, they're real analysts, by the way, I should say, is Paul Measham.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. It's difficult to know how you follow two speeches like that, except ask lots of questions, I guess. I'm going to start with a confession. So I am a mental health nurse by training, and I work in the NHS, and I apologise. I'm being flippant, clearly, but I think it's important to say, because I don't have a conclusion here. I'm presenting what I see as a problem that we all have some skin in the game to solve, and I think it's an important problem. That is that expert discourses that can make a difference don't get heard. And they don't get heard partially because those of us in them sometimes take up positions that by the other. And we also have a responsibility to articulate, build our narrative in such a way that the other can hear us and respond to us. So, a conversation is not happening that should be happening, and we all have to make it happen. There's just a rather deadly silence. And my fear, I guess, is that between, particularly at the moment, where there is such madness in the NHS, particularly at the moment, it's very difficult to be heard even within the organisation, within NHS trusts, within commissioning. It's very difficult to be heard unless you're talking a very, very particular language. And that language doesn't suit a lot of what we want to say. So, you need a way in, and then you need to expand the language. But, it needs to be developed in a way that... I'm going to start with a quote, and it's the one and only quote that I'm going to give, and I guess I don't really know why I'm giving it, other than it has been on my mind, and I took the trouble to... And then I wondered why on earth I was thinking about that. And of course, the question always is, why do we think about anything? In my own analysis, I kind of find that the things that I think about and I don't really understand are the things that I need to spend more time thinking about. So the quote is from R.D. Laing, and if you can't quote Laing in a day like this, so he says, there must be something the matter with him, because he would not be acting as he does unless there was. Therefore, he is acting as he is because there is something the matter with him. He does not think there is anything the matter with him because one of the things that's the matter with him is that he does not think that there is anything the matter with him. Therefore, we have to help him realize that the fact that he does not think there is anything the matter with him is one of the things that is the matter with him. So, hopefully illustrating Barry's point. There's an attempt, I think, often to kind of caricature what happens in the NHS and in lots of health settings. And they, you know, I don't know if there's anyone who works in the NHS here, but if you are, you will know that, you know, we do it to them at the same time, and, you know, there's lots of kind of unhelpful banter at times, you know. But you know, one of the things that gets characterized is that we're constantly, all we're trying to do is reality check. And to some extent that is true, and to some extent it is as laughable as we want to make it laughable. But equally, there are lots of people who are kind of, in their view, on the front line of very serious mental illness, who probably are quite frightened and don't really know what to do in lots of situations. And reality is the thing they cling to, because, and again, I don't know how many of you are clinicians, but when you are sitting faced with someone whose reality is so radically different from your own, and you don't know what they might do about it, then it's frightening. And of course, we all react to that fear in different ways. And I think one of the offers, when it's at its best, and I caveat because psychoanalysis is not always at its best, but when it can help us who don't have that inroad into that discourse, that way of thinking, to think about how to be in the situation in a way that is not only safe for myself, but helpful to the other. And that can often be to be silent. And how are we silent in a way that is not frightening to the other? And sound very esoteric, perhaps, but I just reflect on my own experience. So, you know, when I qualified as a mental health nurse in London, I can't remember how many years ago, I won't tell you, but, you know, I essentially did what lots of nurses are doing now, and I did agency work. I worked in most acute, and would essentially you go in and make up the numbers. For me, it was very valuable, because I kind of learnt a lot, and you do learn a lot when you're kind of half in, half out of an organisation. But equally, I was learning myself, you know, so you make lots of mistakes. And of course, what you don't have in that situation is someone to check your mistakes out with. So some of the things that are difficult in large structures like the NHS is what we kind of prioritise, because you know, the projects like PTP are clearly much smaller than large NHS trusts, and we spend time not only with the patients but with each other, and we listen and we talk, and that often isn't prioritised, you know. So I guess when I kind of bring the problem to my own mind, I think, well, what are the potential solutions? And there's a strategic solution, which is about how do we get inroad to NHS England's thinking about the future of the NHS, and I've got some things to say about that in a minute. But there's also, how do we help NHS staff that we interact with on the ground think that we might possibly be any help to them? You know, that anything we have to say might be in any way valuable. And that's about, I guess, being heard. I think quite often what happens is that we end up, the little contact we do have tends to be at the level of us to the patient's psychiatrist. And quite often, as Dorothée says, it's not the same psychiatrist, because they're quite often in training and they're on rotation rotas, and they only stay 3 to 6 months and then they move on, and that's part of their training. And it's about how do we get to the next level, and that can be quite difficult, you know. So finding ways around the networks is not only kind of important in terms of getting our voice heard, but it's also important for our patients, I guess. So there is something about the Psychosis Therapy Project that I think is important to bring out, and maybe hasn't got as much hearing today as it might have. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible to work with psychotic patients on a one-to-one private basis is absolutely possible. What it doesn't provide is what I think I experience when I am at Islington Mind on a Wednesday afternoon seeing my patients. And that is that my clinic exists within a community. And the community is almost more important than anything I could ever offer to my patients in my clinic. And the value of the analysis, I think, or the value of the therapy is developed by the relationships that happen outside of the clinical sessions. And I think what has happened, certainly in my time working in mental health, is that because, I guess largely because of all the pressures that are on the system, we don't prioritize as much as we absolutely need to the force of good community networks and good community relationships outside of direct clinical interventions. So, of course, what does happen a lot is we do lots of prescribing in the NHS, and doctors, you know, it's a reasonably powerful profession, and there's lots of handing over drugs that might solve X problem. We have done less now than we used to of just having spaces where people can come and be and talk and share their problems. And that was partly accidental, but partly, I think, driven by a policy directive. So, you know, as resources start to constrict, you start looking at what is good value for money as opposed to not. And that gets, I guess, based on what works and what works, to pick up a theme in Dorothee's talk, well, you know, what's your outcome? Are people going to get better? Are they going to be less of a resource drain on the system? Will they get into work? I mean, the whole thrust of the IAPT project was that there was an economic argument that X percentage of people would get back into full-time employment. And that, you know, was a big driver for the money that went into IAPT. Now, I'm not saying IAPT good or bad. I'm saying that economic argument was very powerful and clearly fallacious. Didn't work. You know, so agendas get pushed when people get an inroad, and that's the only voice that's heard. So what works, I think, is a really important question. And to go back to Dorothee's point, I think the theorizing then becomes even more important about how do we articulate the benefit that we give. I think the only thing I would say is that the benefit, certainly in my experience, the benefit is not from anything that I might be doing, but I think from the context in which it's delivered, and that's an important thing to remember, I think. I have, I think, in my time working in mental health, experienced that only twice, I think, in places that I've worked, and neither of them were in the NHS, actually. So I worked in Brixton Prison for a while after qualifying as a nurse, and I had the good fortune of working with a social worker there who was in the HIV team. And of course, you can then experience a kind of position of marginality, don't you? Because you're in a very dogmatic structure like a prison, but you're kind of on the edges of it because you're not really part of the institution. And that taught me a lot about how do you form relationships that are helpful to the people that you're trying to help, and yet not be seen as colluding, quote unquote, with whatever they might be up to. So again, there's something about, I guess, the reality checking. You know, because we don't go into a room and tell people, you know, your delusion is a delusion and you must get on message about what's true. Equally, I don't think we go into a room and say, yes, of course that's right. You know, of course that's how the world is, and of course you're Jesus Christ, and of course, you know, you're etc. You know, there is a position of balance that's very difficult to hold clinically, because it can be found out as just not taking a position at all. Equally, there's a position of balance that is very difficult to hold between organizations and how they talk to each other. and you know, they have very similar challenges actually, and maybe to some extent what we need to start to do is think more clinically about how we interact organizationally. So the other example, I worked for several years at a drug crisis centre in North London. Some of you may know, perhaps, through the City Roads Drug Intervention Project. It's been there for, I don't know, 30-odd years. So I was working there 15 or so years ago, and there was a certain ethos about it. And again, it was kind of seen, I like to think, you know, as PTP might be seen at the moment, as being at the forefront of doing things in a different way, and having a centrality to the patients, the service users, to the community that was formed, that was hopefully a safe, healing place. So again, in my experience, those kind of places are the things that the NHS has lost. We used to put lots of money into day centres, structured day programmes. The money got taken away because it was put into more direct clinical activity. It was also deemed, I think, to be, it was also thought, I think, to be, you know, not good evidence base. And again, I want to just, before I move on from thinking about the NHS, just puncture this myth. So, of course, there's a lot of stuff about evidence-based practice and what's good value for money and all the rest of it, and NICE gets quoted a lot. And of course, I guess the assumption always is, well, if NICE hasn't said it's right and it works, then it clearly doesn't work. And of course, that's not the case. So we'll never find anything new unless we practice new things different ways. So there is something about how are we innovative and how do we practice in a developing way if we're waiting for the stamp of approval that this works. And you know, there's a real tension that's important. You can't be kind of profligately using taxpayers' money. You know, we have a responsibility to spend it wisely and all that. But you know, there's also a responsibility to not dampen real energy and real creativity in the system. So I'm going to kind of wind up remarks. I mean, I guess for me, there are some kind of connecting issues with all of this, which I've kind of lost, but there you go. The things that I would want to promote theoretically, I guess, would be a sense that the primary driver is not death but life. So, and I think one of the criticisms of Freud is that, you know, there's a kind of overemphasis on the death drive, and that plays out in it plays out in many ways in terms of how we construct society, I think, but it plays out in many ways how we construct the gender difference, you know, and the way we treat women and men in services is very different, actually. So it's just something I think to be careful about when we're so committed to theory. That I think whenever we promote the idea that X is Y, then there's maybe a question that Y might not be what it seems to be. You know, so Lang, I don't think is so much in favour these days. I'm not sure.
There's a film coming out.
Is it? Okay.
I don't know how good it is.
I mean, my fantasy, I guess, is that when I started at the project, my fantasy was that Lang would approve.
I think, yeah.
So and you know, I was a kind of fan. So that gave me a good vibe about it. And I think there is something about thinking about what was he trying to underpin. And I know there's lots of criticisms about the later Lang and all the rest of it. But there is something really important, it seems to me, about taking up a position that is on the margin, if you like. There's a position of liberation in that is important. And then finally, I guess that my big heterodoxy is that and you know, Dorothée was almost sending me into spirals of what am I going to say about this? What corrected my anxiety. I don't think we treat anybody. I mean, I don't offer treatment, and I don't apologise for it. And if the question then comes back, well, what do you offer and what value do you have? Then I think I'd be happy to take a very solid position that I offer some time and space for people to talk, and talking in a way that is heard is actually good for me and them, but it's good for the community, you know, and it makes the community safer, actually. I've done quite a lot of work in forensic mental health in the past, and good forensic mental health workers will absolutely tell you the first priority is good relationships. If you have good relationships with your patients and service users, then risk goes down, public safety goes up. You know, so what I offer, and I think you know what psychoanalysis at its best offers to the patient and to others within organisations who work with patients, is the opportunity to create a space of conversation and listening and hearing. I'll close there, I think. Thank you. I lost track of time.
Okay, great. Okay, well, some brilliant presentations there with a wealth of experience from all sorts of perspectives. I used to once work in a think tank, and this is much more thoughtful than anything we did in the think tank, I can tell you that. So, fantastic. We have got time and space for questions. Would you like to ask questions? Yes. And Stefan is got a roving mic, so is that right? Yes. So would you introduce yourself and say who you are, and then ask your questions? So because we're recording the event as well, so I think we have Stefan's eye. Yeah.
Okay. Hi there. Is that on? Yeah. Okay. I'm Anna Minton, and I really enjoyed that. I thought all the presentations were just really, really interesting. So I've got two questions. One is about the referral process and I've got three questions. One is about the referral process, who makes the referral. The second is about whether or not there's a threshold and whether you would consider that some patients may be too unwell. I don't know if you would use that terminology, but too unwell for treatment. And the third question is for Barry, and it's about the case study that you mentioned, the patient you have who sees a psychologist as well, and the psychologist shows the patient diagrams of their brain and says that's where what's wrong with you is. Do you have contact with that psychologist? And I wonder what they think of you and your work.
Okay, shall we, is that?
Is that switched back on? Yes, big people. Okay, just to pick up on the point about whether I have contact with the NHS psychologist. Briefly, very, very briefly at the start of when he was referred to her, and I haven't had contact since then, but from what I understand, she thinks I'm a terrible therapist. So and it's pretty much left at that. I mean, I would certainly be open to more of a dialogue. I don't have any possessiveness over patients. I think that's something that we must really try and work against. But I'm getting the sense she doesn't want a loss of connection with me.
And just to answer your question about referrals. So referrals, we take self-referrals, or we get referrals from all kinds of, the NHS, rehabilitation, recovery, all kinds of sources, social workers, but people can self-refer, really. So it's still early days for the South London project, obviously, because we're starting a pilot in the next few weeks. So we'll have limited places for that. But if people want to self-refer, they can just go on the Islington Mind website, use the self-referral form for the Psychosis Therapy Project, and if we have a Lambeth address, I'll just understand that it's a referral for this area, and we'll process it. And no, we don't have a threshold. We just take people in all states, and in fact, I think that, of course, we work with them differently if they're very unwell. Or, I mean, we have people who go into crisis when they work with us, and we really support them through the crisis. We don't sort of say, oh, you're off our hands. We try to keep them out of hospital as much as possible. In Islington, we're lucky we have crisis houses we can work with, which are hugely helpful. I think maybe we need to think of having one in the area. I don't know how we can do that, but that would be very useful. But I think, no, people can come to us in any condition, really.
Great. We've got more questions. There's a lady in the black, lady in the green, and there are some questions here. So maybe we'll take a few questions. Can we take 2 or 3 questions? And if we can start off with Janet at the front.
Yes, I just wanted to ask some more practical questions. So, is there a time limit to how long someone can come with you? And what about the practitioners? Who are they, and how long do they stay?
So maybe I can answer that quickly. So the work is open-ended, so we don't have a time limit. That's, at least in Islington, I don't know what we're going to do here, but in Islington, it's kind of set by the service user. They can come for how long they, as long as they wish, really. And then, what was your second question? Sorry.
Who are the practitioners?
The practitioners, mainly trainees in psychoanalytic organizations. We have trainees from CFAR, the site, but Tavistock, but we also have people with different backgrounds, more integrative backgrounds, or but they have to have an interest in psychoanalysis, obviously, to want to come to us.
If you could have just pass the mic through the crowd. We've got, yes, keep going.
Hi.
Just say who you are. Would you say who you are and background?
I'm Carrie. Hello. Thank you. It was such an interesting talk, and I suppose I kind of had a comment and also a question. I thought it was really, really interesting and really meaningful what you were saying about the community being so much more powerful than anything we can do as an individual therapist or clinician. And I think as well, maybe it's a bit of a plea, but it's quite easy to get involved in NHS bashing at times. It's a big organisation and it can be a bit faceless, but I think it's important to situate where policies come from a political context, and to understand the political changes that impact on the treatments that are offered, or kind of the provision and support. So the reduction of kind of community space for people who are kind of struggling with their mental health, from my perspective, was a very deliberate political move to reduce spaces where people could work together, as it was part of a whole movement linked towards neoliberalism and a swing to the right. And I think unless we kind of situate our understandings in what's also going on for people socially, we're never really going to get the whole picture. So I think it's really important to see it not just as a kind of an NHS-based policy decision, but part of a kind of a wider approach that our entire society is taking. And I guess the other thing that I was kind of interested in, because I've never heard about your project before and it sounds really fascinating, is kind of what's the role for kind of the service user voice in what you're doing? What's the role for service user feedback or collaboration? My main contact with psychosis work has been through Hearing Voices networks, which have been wonderfully supportive and incredibly psychologically and also politically powerful for the people I've known who've been involved. And I kind of wonder how that sits alongside what you guys do. It sounds like you offer something kind of very different, but also in some ways I feel like there's probably a link and a shared community there. So yeah, just kind of a bit of a plea to working together and not always turning amongst ourselves and looking slightly outward.
Yeah, I just want to say that the Islington project was actually, it came out of the Hearing Voices group that's run by our colleague Pat O'Driscoll, who's been doing a wonderful job there for years. And when I was working there as a trainee, I started doing individual therapy with psychotic patients. And then it seemed that there was a demand for individual therapy that came from the group itself. So there is a very direct link with the Hearing Voices group at Islington Mind, and we work together all the time. It's been very useful because we work with the same service users. And in terms of including the service users, well, you know, we hang out with them all the time. So basically, there's the hierarchies are just really kind of broken down. And on Wednesdays, as Paul was talking, we all sit together, and, you know, therapists and service users. And so we really, and there's so much peer support going on at the same time. So it's a real community, and it kind of grew organically, which is the beauty of it, because we didn't try to make it happen. And now we sort of have food together, it's a beautiful spread, and it's just become a real social sort of event in the week. So, but it sort of happened on its own, which is kind of what really is. I don't know if Paul wants to say anything.
Yes, well, and just also should add, we at Lambeth and Southwark Mind, we have a Hearing Voices group that is funded by Southwark NHS, and we work collaboratively in partnership with them. And we have a very strong service user ethos throughout the organisation. You come and have a coffee with us sometime and find out more. But back to Paul.
Well, I'm not sure there's very much to add to what Dorothée said, but I mean, thank you for the question. Sorry, can you hear me? Thank you for the question. You know, I absolutely agree with you that the important thing is seeing the whole picture and being able to open a conversation with people where we disagree. And disagreement is fine. You know, I think what we don't do enough of is have honest, challenging conversations where we can say, I have a different view from you, and what do you think? So we shouldn't avoid that. But framed in such a way that it is possible to be heard. You know, and that's the tricky bit. You know, that's the challenge. In terms of the community. There's something very subtle about communities and when they work and when they don't work, and you know when they're not working, and we don't often spend enough time thinking about what supports them to work. I think what happens actually at the Hub is a very sophisticated thing about the relationships within the community, and bears well from some examination, I would have thought, you know, because it doesn't just happen.
Good. I'm just mindful of time. So, Stefan, could I ask a favour? And you take some comments from can we just take some observations and questions from 2 or 3 people, and then the panel can sort of collectively answer. Is that fair? So can we just, because I know we've got quite a few hands up, so if you can just say your point and then pass the microphone on. Is that okay? And do introduce yourself.
Yes. Yeah, my name is Antonella Favaro. I want to ask you, does any of you know of people who have been basically taking all sorts of medication for maybe diagnoses like bipolar and schizophrenia? Do you know of any people who has actually been able to stop taking medications and have psychotherapeutic support, or their medication have been greatly reduced, and obviously with the support of psychotherapy or other therapies?
Thank you. And if we can just take some additional questions.
So I am doing a training in counselling psychology, and I've been listening to what you were saying about the psychologist and how she reacted, and I kind of asked myself what that is all about. And I came to the idea of the reflexivity of, you know, what is actually our understanding of neurological happenings in terms of psychosis, which is really not a lot. So I was thinking about the anxiety of the unknown, the kind of idea of how anxious are we as practitioners to not really know what's going on, and how much are we projecting that onto the clients or the patients or whatever you call it. And how important it can be to actually have a little bit of training of reflexivity towards your own idea of reality, and how much you're projecting that anxiety onto the patient, and by that as well thinking about language and how we use it in our everyday life, and how we can kind of have to look beyond how we use language and how we understand the patient by using language. I think it's really important to kind of question these things, and again, what you said as well, find the balance between what reality is and what's going on in the patient's mind, and to go on that journey and to be curious. and to not be blinded by this anxiety.
Yeah.
Okay.
Curious.
Thank you. Well,
Yeah.
we can and we've got one. Right, keep this in mind, panel. It's go on. So, please.
My name's Anne Scott. I wanted, in a sense, what I wanted to say comes very closely on from what our colleague has just said about reality. I'm incredibly sympathetic to pretty much 99% of everything that's being said. I wanted to raise a puzzle about what happens to the concept of consensual reality in relation to this whole field. Because Barry, when you began with the critique of the idea of consensual reality, I wasn't sure where we ended up in terms of whether ultimately there is anything we can call consensual reality. Now, I think that when Dorothée talked about people who are very unwell, in a sense that brings us back to the idea of some kind of consensual reality, because if we didn't have a concept of people being unwell, we wouldn't be able to do anything other than something very relativist. And I think what I'd say is that I think we're all in the middle of a consensual reality this afternoon, because we accept the role relationships we're in. I'm in the audience, you're on the panel. If I started disrobing, if I came up onto the podium and started hitting one of you, I think you would think I was quite unwell. And I think you'd be right to think that. So I think what I'm saying is and these are conversations that in a sense it's easier to have over coffee or, you know, in a very informal way, but I think I just wanted to pose a point about, can we not lose all sight of something that is consensual? And after all, Freud did talk about, then that wonderful quote from the patch, about the patch, he did have a theory which included the word reality. You know, so I would see if we could find some way of staying with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall we maybe answer Isabel? Do you want to say something about it?
Please.
Well, I feel like I've got a few sort of points to and I might just go down the line, if that's okay. Is that all right? So, in answer to the first question, I think you would have had experience of patients coming off medication, or
not enough. Though.
Not enough. I mean, we have had those experiences.
We have people who are not medicated at all and not diagnosed, and actually the therapy works a lot better with them. That's what I will say. But to sort of help people, you know, it's a struggle. It's a big struggle. But I'm connecting with other organizations and I think the Hearing Voices Network also supports people to get off medication, and I think we need to link more with them so that we try to advocate more.
I mean, there's probably more experience of people changing medication and you know, because so the nurses come down and then they move over. So there's something of that experience at that point, but it's not for very long.
And I'll just pick up on the next two points and questions that were raised, because I suppose they were more directed against me. Is it absolutely, I completely agree with having more reflexivity in practice, more awareness of oneself and one's position, perhaps what one has been through oneself and how that bears upon reality. Also the traditions that one is schooled in and that one is trained in as well, and how that might make certain phenomena more understandable, but might also hide from us other phenomena which we might not be able to see. And I really don't think sort of forcing anything on anybody is helpful at all, and that was this mistake. I mean, I was kind of sort of quite flabbergasted when my patient reported back that this was the experience that he was having, and it's not a therapeutic approach. Whether or not she is absolutely right that there is this distinctive fault and she has located it, and he just willfully won't be able to see it, it's not therapeutically useful. That's perhaps the point.
Okay, thank you.
To come on to Anne's point, which is, I suppose, a trickier question to answer, I'm going to give you two answers. The first is that, philosophically speaking, no, there is no such thing as consensual reality. That as soon as we get into, and I left this out of my talk because it's a bit too overly philosophical, but as soon as we get into trying to define what consensual reality is, we find ourselves in a process of infinite regress. We get stuck in a vicious circle. However, the point that you raised, that were you starting to behave in ways that would break perhaps the norms that have been established by this group, by people within this room, and we might want to say that you don't seem to be in your right mind or very well. Well, I think really we're talking about sort of customs and tradition and what's been accepted. I think just going back to the Freud, what he's talking about is different ways in which reality is constructed, neurotically or psychotically, and perhaps that's where I would place the emphasis, is on the different psychological functions that Dorothée sort of spoke a little bit about her talk, and how these construct different realities. So I don't think there's better or worse or right or wrong. We've just got to approach them as different structures. That would be.
Yeah, and I think Freud was interested in psychic reality, really, though there is this idea of reality testing as being part of the development of the individual. As the child, for example, sort of, experiences frustration, that frustration comes from something that is experienced as reality. But at the same time, that's in itself a construct, I think, by definition. Now, what I mean by people being very unwell is when, in fact, they are under the sway of very destructive impulses, and they sort of are in danger, really. Their voices are telling them to do things that, would be very serious. And so what we encourage them to do, often, we don't sort of tell them, well, the voices don't exist, but we encourage them to not believe the voices. So that's kind of what we do. And we try to be a benevolent voice, which is kind of the best thing we can do. But sometimes we don't weigh very much, and that's the truth. Sometimes we're facing a wall of water, and we get crushed by it, and people just go out as if they were in outer space, and we just have to let them go. And
I should say there will be drinks afterwards at the pub around the corner, and you're welcome to join us for this particular discussion, and as the audience. But there are so many questions. I will allow us to extend up. It's 1:55, so I'm just in terms of reality, I'm just going to allow 5 more minutes. Is that okay for the audience? So Stefan, if you could take, there's a gentleman that's been very patiently waiting at the back, right in the corner, wearing a blazer and some nifty-looking glasses. If you could take him, and then maybe we can take a few more as well.
Xavier Fourteau, thank you very much. I have to say sometimes I'm a bit uncomfortable when we talk about psychosis or even psychotics or psychotic subjects, because it covers realities that are so different, isn't it? Like, I've known schizophrenic people, we could deal with absence in the way, as you talked about the 4DA. So maybe my question is very general, but it's about the usefulness, but also the limits of diagnosis in psychoanalysis. I think you just said that when people are not diagnosed, sometimes it works better. And if I could ask a second question, I don't want to be rude, but it's just something I wanted to raise. I was wondering, in your organizations, what is a senior analyst when working with psychosis? Are there junior analysts, and what's the difference? Is working with psychotics a question of experience, of academic, theoretical knowledge, and who can tell?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. We're going to have a comment. Also, the lady in black here, just straight ahead of me. Thank you. Before we take her question, how many people here do work for the NHS? Just a show of hands. We have. Thank you. How many people are trained therapists here? Yeah. Okay. How many people are from North London? I've already known. That's okay. Please.
And how many people who experience psychosis? Do we have?
Yeah,
how many people who experience psychosis? Personally? Yeah. Yeah. Personally.
Like to Thank you, please.
Can you hear me? Is it? Yeah. So I just wanted to say a couple of points. I find all the talks really interesting. And I wanted to contribute as someone who's experienced 2 psychoses and come through them, completed my degree. I'm studying a master's in psychology now. I'm not on any medication, and I really think it's so possible. And I've got a lot of respect for how psychoanalysts and analysts deal with the integrity of individuals going through psychosis. And I do think that the NHS is a very violent system. And I'm quite nervous because I don't like asking questions in front of lots of people. That said, I did have a few points about some of the things that were said. One thing I experienced when I had my first psychosis was that I have a mother that runs a therapeutic community and a father, a divorce, and a father who's much more straight-minded. And during my psychosis, they both disagreed about what kind of treatment I should have. And my mother spent 6 months saying that my experiences were very valuable and to let me go on that journey and to listen and not judge. And I have to say, at the end of it, I was very appreciative of the people that took a more pragmatic approach, because my experience of reality was very damaging and very vulnerable and very challenging. And all I wanted at the time to say was I wanted to get out of that confusion and regain my sense of reality. So I think while I acknowledge, and one of you said it's a delicate balance, I do think it's important to acknowledge that for most people going through psychosis, it's a very challenging, traumatic experience that people would really like to be led out of, and that's probably why they're seeking therapy anyway. The other thing I wanted to say was about working interdiscipline. You know, I've developed a keen interest in psychiatry and neuroscience alongside psychology, and I think that there's a lot to learn from neuroimaging and psychiatric models of what might cause psychosis, like the dopamine hypothesis. And I think that perhaps there's therapeutic ways that we can learn to work more gently with people, like maybe through music therapy or analysis, which you could potentially use neuroimaging to prove its effectiveness. You know, you could find gentle ways to change that, you know, because they do find that there is a biological basis to a lot of these states.
Thank you, and thank you very much indeed. If I could ask the panel just to make these your final kind of comments, because we've got you know, sort of someone's twitching over there. So no, go on, all right, go on. Yeah.
I'll just to address Xavier's question, I think, you know, psychosis and versus neurosis, I have to sort of say you work very differently because of the capacity for metaphorization. If people lose their metaphorical function and their degrees to that, you cannot do interpretative work by definition. So that's a huge difference in terms of technique, I think. And so but then there's a great variety of, the landscape is very broad on that level. And what was the second question you asked? I can't remember now. Oh yes, okay. Senior analyst means someone who is a qualified analyst as opposed to a trainee, and then the number of hours, there's no substitute for that. It's hours and hours and hours. And the more hours, the better. That's it. And then, did you want to say anything to your wonderful contribution, or?
Well, just maybe just to, and thank you so much for bringing your voice and for speaking from that experience, because of course you've heard from 3 people sitting, quote unquote, sort of in the role of experts here, but to have the patient experience is really so important. So thank you for that. And just to pick up on the point about interdisciplinary work, I think that there is absolutely no substitute for that. Although we are giving a psychoanalytic perspective on how to work with the psychoses, and perhaps we've found them particularly valuable, I would certainly say that there are lots of other ways and lots of other factors to consider. I mean, we've spoken about the mental health crisis. We know increasingly that you are more likely to suffer a mental health crisis if you are living in challenging economic and social circumstances. And this is part of what is fueling the crisis that we're seeing. So sociological perspectives, of course there is a role for neuroscience and neuroimaging and understanding physically what goes on with the brain. But we're discussing, I suppose, today about what you do in a conversation when you're working with somebody suffering from psychosis.
One other point, last point I wanted to make was also that the way I got out of that psychosis was exactly by ignoring the voices. So that was the last point. I find that really helpful.
But I think if you were to be led out of the psychosis, I think you would be doing the leading. That's what we sort of really believe. We might help you with that or guide you, but you would know best. That's it.
Okay, I'd like to just ask I'm extremely grateful for this panel. I think they're incredibly, they've come freely and done so much thinking for us, really pioneering work. So, and often this lecture gives us some food for thought for the whole year ahead in terms of some of the projects that we get interested in and do so. It's my first time to hear the three panelists speak, and I personally am extremely grateful, and I just would like the audience to show their appreciation for our panelists.